I'll have to just kind of work it out in the...
Sure. So you touched on this in the pitch, but what do you see the kind of week-to-week conflicts and the engine of the show being?
Yeah, so I think the core conflict is Mo being unable to fulfill both the obligations of the motivational program and her Reaper responsibilities. So I didn't really touch on this in the pitch, but I had a couple of ideas of other episodes that I think helped to illustrate it. So yeah, a couple example episodes that kind of illustrate this conflict. So when assigned to do a random act of kindness through the program, Mo agrees to make one last stop for a soul before taking him to the underworld. But he chains himself to a radiator and refuses to leave. So there's this idea of like, okay, she's doing this exercise that's going to be beneficial for her through the program, but as a direct result, like it interferes with her Reaper duties. She has to fix that. So another idea here is when Tina stipulates that Mo has to, quote, be there unconditionally for another seminar attendee for one full day, Mo misses a soul pickup. And the soul ends up going on a haunting rampage. So again, there's this idea of like, trying to be a good seminar attendee, but that directly leading to issues with her professional life.
Yeah, it's sort of contrasting and conflicting those two themes and arcs of her being both this seminar attendee and wanting to live in that world of being a motivational speaker, but also killing people essentially.
Right. So we know the stakes in the supernatural world if she's failing at her job as a Reaper. What do you feel like the stakes are in the motivational speaking world when she fails at her lessons and that kind of thing because of her responsibilities as a Reaper?
So I think one is just going to be disappointing the people that she forms a bond with. So I think she's going to form obviously like a strong bond with Tina. And so, yeah, feeling like she's letting her down, and also Fred, but maybe more fundamentally feeling like she's letting herself down. Because I think one of these things about motivational speaking is that you're meant to really like take ownership of your own sort of mental well-being and your own health. And so I think, yeah, feeling like she's not living up to her full potential and falling back into old patterns. There might actually be a theme in the show of like kind of relapsing and going back to that life that was ultimately detrimental to her, and that constant struggle to kind of break out of that and find what it is that actually makes her happy.
So you feel that being a Grim Reaper is almost like an addiction?
Interesting. So I don't think it's an addiction in the sense that she sort of craves it, not in that sense, but it's something that she's trying to break out of. So I guess in that sense, she feels trapped by it, but that's more just because of her circumstance and being...
It's more like an unhealthy lifestyle or a dead-end job or something like that.
Right, but to that point, is there a way for her to break out of this lifestyle without sort of dealing with the consequences of ending up in purgatory? Is there a way for herself to exile herself from this lifestyle?
I need to think about that more.
That's fine.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that goes to like a world-building issue of like, is it possible for a Grim Reaper to stop being a Grim Reaper, basically? And maybe, yeah, I think that might happen later on in terms of like Mother Time finding out what's going on and whether there's a way to sort of barter. Maybe she has to give up something really important in order to be able to break out. And so I think that would be like a long, series-long question.
So this is definitely a long-term thing, but I definitely feel like it is important to think of elements like, is there a way out for her long-term?
Yeah.
Whether or not there is, I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of those kind of arcs over the series, I did like at the end that you had this kind of thing that sets up a chain reaction by Mo messing up her mission, and that kind of gives us this momentum into the series. But have you thought more about what that chain reaction would be and what it actually means for the world and the rest of the show?
That I have not thought about too much. And I'm also not very wedded to that. Yeah, I think that my general idea for the pilot is that as the result of going to the seminar for those first few times, she does something to break herself out of the comfort zone. So in this iteration, she convinces someone to not kill himself, but I'm not really wedded to that. I think it could end up being something else in the first draft.
Yeah, maybe she doesn't kill someone who then kills Mother Time.
Or maybe she starts inspiring other Reapers to join this motivational conference thing, and it just basically forms a Reaper union, or starts breaking people.
What about a Reaper cult? She forms her own cult,
like a Blue Oyster cult. You don't fear the Reaper.
Is that the opening credits of Fear the Reaper?
Oh my God, these guys.
Team Up podcast about television writing and becoming a TV writer. I'm Alex Friedman, aka TV Colin.
And I'm Nick Watson on Twitter _NJ Watson.
And today we continue our mentorship journey where we help one of our listeners workshop their pilot from inception to final draft.
And once again, we are joined by Paul Chan. Welcome.
Hey guys, how's it going?
It's going good. Thanks for being here. And this week we are taking a look at the beat sheet of his pilot Mid-Death Crisis, which you can read at paperteam.co/134. So let's get started.
So just a super quick recap of our goal with this whole mentorship. It is a monthly workshop where we help a writer, who is one of our listeners, create a new original TV pilot script from inception through to final draft.
That's right. And in our inaugural mentorship episode, which was PT128, we got introduced to Paul's new half-hour comedy pilot idea, Mid-Death Crisis, and we familiarized ourselves with the world and characters he was creating when he gave us a basic series overview of the show. We also gave him some of our notes. We had a creative discussion about the show, and Paul continued to the next step of the project, the beat sheet, which is what this episode is all about.
Yeah, and if you want to hear Paul's thoughts on our first session coming out of that and how he's been working to address all the notes and everything that we covered there, you can take a listen to our Patreon exclusive episode where we tackled all of these questions and more. You can do that at paperteam.co/Patreon. That's Patreon.
That's right. And as we said in our first mentorship episode, we want this process to be interactive with you guys listening to us right now. So you can follow along at home, whether it's in your artist group or our Facebook group. And we've had our first thread about basic series overview to coincide with the release of the first step in the mentorship episode, with people sharing their series overviews on our Facebook group. So in conjunction with this episode, we will be creating a thread where you can share your beat sheets of your new pilot and give feedback on other members' content. And you can do that at paperteam.co/group to join our Facebook group.
Yeah, we really want to encourage you to take an active role in this and be a part of the community and put your ideas forth and become kind of a big writers group for each other. We actually also had some feedback from our listeners via email regarding Mid-Death Crisis and that first mentorship episode. So we did want to highlight an email that we got from listener Steve Troutman, who, funnily enough, is also co-host of the Writers Guild of America West 3rd and Fairfax podcast, which is a great podcast. If you guys have heard of it, definitely recommend tuning into that one. So we're not going to be reading the whole email, but we did want to bring up a couple of the thoughts that Steve had on the overall concept of the show, which again, we've got previous Staffer episodes. This is not going to be covering the beat sheet that we'll be talking about later. And we can just discuss a little bit amongst Paul and ourselves.
The first issue that Steve brought up was this idea of characters, and specifically the fact that Mid-Death Crisis, quote, has a strong single main character at its center as opposed to a two-hander, three-hander, or ensemble. This type of series almost always requires a popular star for that role. Sandra Oh and Margaret Cho are the only two that come to mind, end quote. Now, we did want to bring up the fact that at least I feel this is kind of a problematic excuse to say that, oh, we can do this show because there's no strong Asian American lead in existence right now. And I would argue that this is kind of why we don't have that much progress in diversity, is because we don't have that Asian American lead to cast. Therefore, we cannot cast this Asian American show. It's sort of this circuitous reasoning that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think that we need to be creating shows and providing opportunities for the next Sandra Oh and Margaret Cho to emerge. You know, there are plenty of shows where almost complete unknowns have gone on to become huge stars because of that vehicle. Look at Friends or Freaks and Geeks or ER. You know, there'll always be some role in the show for your big star to attract attention. You know, perhaps the Mother Time character or Tina or even Fred, you know, could fill that need. I don't think that we need to place the responsibility solely on the shoulders of the protagonist to be a huge star in order to make the show. Aside from all of that, I think that casting probably isn't really a consideration at this early stage of a creative project. I think that the concept, again, isn't even necessarily based on Mo's ethnicity or age. So it feels like this is something to address much later when agents and producers, et cetera, are trying to package it, sell it, pitch it, and whatever.
Right, especially at this stage where the goal is to create a compelling pilot. So if you're just creating a pilot only based on sellability of the concept or sellability of the lead characters, I think that's sort of a short-sighted way of thinking about a spec sample, which is supposed to put you on the top of a reading pile and get you staffed or potentially develop this project later on. But it's really to make you shine as a writer, not someone who is very well aware of the production. The next element that Steve brought up was elements surrounding the world.
I think Steve raises a couple of good points here. Discussing the world, for example, the device of the death being 24 hours after being touched. He wondered about the logic of, what happens with people who die suddenly in an accident or a medical condition in the middle of the night. And, potentially that bring out more questions than it answers. Like, what if a living person unintentionally touches a reaper? all of that kind of stuff. And I think they're interesting questions to explore about the world. He also mentioned, other different kinds of Reapers who deal in different assignments or types of deaths, just one for elderly people or one for the different kind of areas, or some more prestigious than others, as Mo worked her way up from the heavy duty assignments to something better. Now, we are going to touch on that device a little bit later in the episode. But honestly, I think that some of these questions and quote-unquote problems we can look at as opportunities for story rather than obstacles to it. So what if Mo does accidentally touch someone? Now she has 24 hours to undo it because they're not meant to die or something, or some fun irony where he ends up dying anyway in some other way. Maybe it's actually Fred, and this is a huge season story point about her almost accidentally killing her love interest, etc.
Yeah, one thing I did want to reiterate is that this mentorship process chronicles an ongoing, ever-evolving creative process. Even though we are recording this episode of this podcast, which means to some level the content appears to be locked in and finished, the reality is that Mid-Death Crisis is still being figured out. We are in the early stages, still on the beat sheet. So even though world-related questions are interesting questions that can generate stories and ideas and so forth, not having specific answers to every single issue at the beat sheet stage is not something people should hold against Paul or Mid-Death Crisis, because this is only step 2.
Yeah, and Steve's last point in the email was regarding the stakes, which again we are going to be covering a lot more on in the later episode going through the beat sheet. So we'll table those thoughts for now.
Once again, we do really appreciate the feedback that you guys have sent in, and especially Steve for sending us his thoughts. So if you have your own thoughts about the process or have questions that you want to ask Paul about Mid-Death Crisis or his writing, you can always send them to ask@paperteam.co. But now, let's get into the beat sheet.
Paul, can you just walk us through the broad strokes of your beat sheet? And just for our listeners, you can find that in our show notes as well and read along.
Yeah, sure. All right. So we start off, and Mo is reading a book in her car in Brooklyn, and suddenly a man falls off a building nearby. He's like a drunk 20-something, and Mo ends up picking up this guy's soul and driving him to the portal to the underworld. While there, she meets with her boss, Mother Time, who chastises her for getting yet another low-star rating. Mo goes home to her apartment where she hangs out, and her friend Gerald, who is another Reaper, comes over and asks her to pick up a soul that he's meant to pick up the next day. And Mo begrudgingly agrees. In the second act, Mo goes to pick up the soul that she promised Gerald she motivational host gives a rousing speech and leads everyone in a powerful sort of team building visualization exercise that has a big impact on Mo and shakes her to her core. After the motivational seminar, Mo goes with the rest of the seminar attendees to night bowling as a kind of like a fun after seminar activity. And while there, she encounters the person whose soul she's meant to pick up for Gerald, a woman named Harriet. And Harriet is about to commit suicide. She's standing on top of the bowling alley and is thinking about jumping off. And Mo basically convinces her to not kill herself. Mo goes back to her apartment and signs up for the 10-week seminar, just as Gerald bursts into her apartment, freaking out that Mo didn't pick up the soul. He then proceeds to kill one of Mo's neighbors in order to cover up the fact that he basically let a soul get away. And we end on Mo horrified at the chain reaction she's created.
Excellent. Now let's get into our thoughts. And first of all, let's talk about things we absolutely loved in this beat sheet.
Yeah, I really like the Millennial Reaper Corey showing up on a bird scooter. I thought that was a funny moment. And it's nice to see the kind of the differences between the different Reapers and, the ones who've been younger or older, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely agree that contrasting all those Reapers and adding depth to the sort of the differentiations between those people is a thing that you should lean into, not just push back.
I also like that fun subversion of the idea of purgatory actually being some sort of eternal life where you're forced to live forever instead of just dying peacefully.
Yeah, another thing that is really cool in terms of the character elements is the fact that you added another dimension to Mo's character. I thought was really interesting, especially adding that mystery surrounding her past, her having, maybe not visions, but at least remembering perhaps who she was before all all this different element of mystery really adds potential depth and legs to her as a character, which I really appreciated.
And I did like that kind of dark turn at the end where we see that it's not all just kind of zany comedy. There is real darkness and death and kind of stakes and consequences to what's going on here as well with Gerald killing the neighbor Steve.
Yeah, that was definitely an interesting add-on. The other thing I do want to point out is I do love the line, plotting your points on the y-axis. That was a great line. All right, let's get into our actual notes. And first of all, let's tackle the sort of macro notes and big picture and the structure of the beat sheet and the pilot.
Yeah, so in terms of the acts and also the act breaks, there was a little bit of work that we could do there. In particular, Act 2 felt the most thin to me, and I think that there's some areas there where we can pull from other acts and kind of restructure where the acts are actually ending, and also finding stronger act outs on a lot of those.
Yeah, I definitely had similar thoughts about the act outs really pushing the momentum in those act outs, which we can talk about in a second. In terms of the acts themselves, I also agree that the second act felt a bit thin, but I do feel you have opportunities to extend the world of Reapers and sort of get an idea of her routine and even the threat level, because you do have real estate. I think this is an example of a beat sheet that it's not overstuffed for plot. I think you can add more depth and world building to this pilot and add in the depth to it.
Sometimes it's better to have a beat sheet that works on the bare bones rather than overstuffing it, like you said. So it's not necessarily a criticism, but just that there might be some more opportunities there. I guess for me, one of the big things was that I felt that Act 2 should actually end a little bit further into where you currently have Act 3. It felt like kind of an odd act out to just kind of be the end as she's agreeing to go bowling with the seminar gang, unless it has some kind of greater story consequence. So it felt almost more like Act 3 should probably end when Mo decides to sign up for the seminar, because that feels like a stronger kind of act out to me.
Interesting. I had another thought about the end of Act 2, because in my mind, so the emotional arc of the episode is about Mo's transformation. And that transformation is in part triggered by Harriet, or sort of be confronted with this person that she has to kill or not. And so it made sense to me to end Act 2 slightly earlier and at the point where Mo is put in this position where either she's going to have to kill this amazing person she doesn't want to kill, or she doesn't kill her, but then Mo is basically going against everything she's believed in, plus risking the worst thing that can happen to her, which hopefully has been crystallized in the first act of that threat. So that's just my thought on the end of Act 2.
Yeah, I could honestly see it ending at either of those places. And to that point, I think that you can kind of pull some of the stuff from the end of Act 1 that's currently there into the start of Act 2, and instead have the first act ending on the meeting with Mother Time and the big stakes of all of that, and then that's our act out. And then at the top of Act 2, we're in the apartment watching reruns, etc.
Yeah, and to that point, outside of our own pitches and fixes, I do want to say that sort of the common note that we seem to have about the act outs is that they don't really feel like they carry enough momentum or surprises to move us to keep watching and follow the next act and so forth, because you got to end on some active question or emerging problem or some kind of threat or twist that makes us want to read on. And as they stand now, the act outs feel a bit passive, especially for Mo.
Right, or almost a little bit arbitrary. It's like, here's a scene, and then, you can kind of end it anywhere. But like Alex is saying, I think if you find those strong moments of like, oh God, what's going to happen next? Something big just changed or flipped or reversed or whatever, that's going to push us to the next thing. I did kind of like the act outs on the end of the episode, though. I felt like that was probably the strongest one, where Gerald kind of goes crazy.
Yeah, I did have one note about it. I do love that episode out on Gerald murdering the person. I would actually end the episode there, because I think the beat sheet that we saw doesn't end on Gerald killing someone, but more about Gerald thinking that Corey is this other threat. Anyway, my point is that I feel like you should flip those beats in the sense that the end of the episode should be about Gerald killing someone and Mo being the cause of that, which is much stronger than someone else that Mo might be worried about for some other person.
Just flip that around, and so he's freaking out about being paranoid about Corey and whatever. Then he goes in and kills this guy. He's like, he's not going to get me. I'm going to get my soul. I'm not going to go to purgatory, whatever. And then we can still end on Mo horrified watching like the blood splatter all over the walls or whatever it happens to be, which I think is a really fun kind of thing. It reminds me of like Barry in some ways. I think that kind of like dark ending to things.
I don't know if you have any thoughts, Paul, on any.
Yeah, totally. That completely makes sense. I totally agree about the act outs. One of the act outs, because I've been thinking about this myself, would love to hear your thoughts. I've been thinking for the Act 2 break, it could be like maybe Mo gets a text or a call from Gerald being like, okay, cool, have you gotten Harriet yet? And then she realizes that in kind of getting swept in the seminar, like Harriet has kind of gotten away. And so the act out is then, she's kind of getting this pressure from Gerald to hunt Harriet down, but she's kind of like let her slip through her.
Yeah, I mean, I do like the outside pressure, and I feel like the Harriet of it all is something that we're going to address later on in terms of character motivation and so forth. But I do feel like Mo needs to be put in sort of that threshold moment of whether she's going to be deciding to kill Harriet or not kill Harriet. This is sort of the extrapolating the bigger stakes here, but that's my thought of the sort of the crossroad moment she needs to be in.
Yeah, crystallizing or being caught between those two worlds, and like, is she going to go have margaritas and bowling or whatever and join them for the next game, or is she going to kill Harriet and take her and do what she'd like to do?
Right, and I feel like, to your point, Paul, the fact that she's getting that text and getting that clock, which I think is great idea to have sort of that clock and that reminder of a threat, can put her in that position. But that's not the end-all, be-all. I think that's just a visualization of, oh, wait, she needs to make this decision now.
Right.
You can even have moments where Mo is, they're bowling and, they're going to go pick up their bowls or whatever, and she's like, kind of like, all right, I got to touch her. It's 24-hour clock, so like she's trying to find opportunities to kill her in the middle of this thing, and then can't quite bring herself to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to sort of put her in a position where she clearly has a shot on Harriet, but then doesn't do it for whatever reason. At least maybe that's Act 3. I'm not sure if it's Act 2, but at least hinting at the fact that she's considering not killing Harriet.
Right, that totally makes sense.
So moving on from the structure to more of the stakes. One of the big questions, I guess, we both had is, why is it important to the afterlife that souls are having a good ride on the way there? And I know we touched on this in the previous episode, but for me personally, I think that we've seen the consequences of bad ratings, but it's still unclear why it's important to management what's going on. I don't think we can just hand wave it away in the way that Mother Time currently does with who knows, especially with the new system that's just been implemented. I'm curious now what's changed and why now. And so I do think we maybe need to get into this idea of what you mentioned last episode about restless souls and how that affects things.
Just to tackle something else on your thought, I did have a question about sort of why Mo is incentivized to follow this path, especially the status quo. I feel like it's such a tremendous change in the way this world has been functioning for thousands of years that, as Nick said, I feel like hand-waving it isn't quite giving us that to the fact that this is going to be the new status quo.
So what are your thoughts on that side of things, Paul?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I definitely hear that. Could be unsatisfying to kind of hand wave it away. I guess my concern there was getting kind of bogged down in the mechanics of it, but it does sound like maybe there's some kind of explanation there. So I think, yeah, even just in that scene, having one of the characters give that exposition.
It doesn't have to be exposition as much as I think this is an opportunity for setting up, for example, Mother Time as a character, because she can say whatever you want her to say, and it could be a lie. It could be whatever element that she has to say to placate Mo in that moment. And then maybe down the line, whether it's in the pilot, future episode, whatever it is, you can reveal that actually there's another more perhaps nefarious reason why there's ratings now. I just feel like there needs to be some kind of reasoning for why ratings, why here, why now. I think that's kind of the note that we're heading at.
Right, and it's kind of a two-part thing. It's like, in general, why does it matter for souls to have a good time if they're going to go die and go somewhere anyway? And, like you said before, it could be because they get restless and that disrupts the afterlife or something like that. And then you've also kind of like, it's almost a hat on a hat here with it's a new system and we're going to this ratings now, but there's also no reason for that. So like, I think if you're going to put that element in there, there definitely needs to be a reason for it to have just been implemented. There's a new boss upstairs, there's whatever, I think you kind of go with one or the other, or you find the rationale behind it. Like you said, you don't need to explain like the mechanics of it all to someone, just the reasoning behind it in a simple way.
I would even ask you, why do you feel it's important that this is a new element being introduced in this world as opposed to Mo being used to dealing with Uber ratings?
Right. Our explanation could be, it's been this way forever. This is just a new mask on it or whatever. So like, is there a reason for a why now for ratings?
I don't think that the newness is super important, actually. I think I can totally strip that out and just sort of simplify it. I think if I wanted to stick with it being a new thing, it could kind of tie into this idea of Mother Time being the new boss, right? She's like, I'm coming in after Father Time. Let's modernize this, right? Like, it's always been important that the souls were in this emotional state in order to pass through. But now, we're in the 21st century. Let's like modernize this.
Right. It's called rest in peace for a reason,
Yeah, right. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Like, it's definitely not important to the story that it's new, and maybe that just kind of introduces needless complexity. So I'll definitely think about how to get.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's about sort of adding reasons for why Mo is doing what she's doing and what triggers that transformation. I feel like if she's rejecting a new thing, I think that makes sense in a vacuum, but then it introduces other questions that we don't necessarily want in a pilot. If this new thing is happening, how are all the other Reapers reacting? Like you said, it introduces a level of complexity that doesn't necessarily add to it or add interest to it.